Jai Radha Madhavam Kunja Bihari. Jai Radha Madhavam Kunja Bihari. Gopi Janaballabha Giri Bharadari. Yasodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Paramajakacharya Prabhupada Satashi Shri Maha's Divine Grace 8 C Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Grantrad Shrimad Bhagavatam Ki Samveda Bhakta Vrinda Ki Gaur Premanandi. All glories to the Semel devotees. All glories to the Semel devotees. All glories to the Semel devotees. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Jnanatimidandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandehang Shri Guru Shri Yuta Pada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Scha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitamscha. Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, so we've got a lot of territory to cover. We'll see how things go. I'm not going to do the verses responsively because there's too many of them and they're long, and already we're kind of off on a late foot here. Ko namaloke purusharta saravit pura katanam bhagavat kata sudham apiya karanjalibhir bhavapaham aho virajeta vina naretaram. Ko namaloke purusharta saravit pura katanam bhagavat kata sudham apiya karanjalabhir bhavapaham aho virajeta vina naretaram. So this verse is, am I doing the right verse here? Yes, Canto 3, chapter 12 rather. Or am I doing the wrong? Oh. Are we on chapter 12? That's right. I got the wrong chapter. That's why we're off here. So what has happened, I guess, is during Rath Yatra, the speakers and the verses that they were supposed to cover were they fell off the cog, and yesterday our Pancharatna did 3.12.49, and he was supposed to do the next chapter actually, 3.13.1 and 2, but evidently the previous speakers hadn't accomplished that, so I'm going to go from 50 to the end of the chapter, which is 57, and that way, starting tomorrow, we can do chapter 13. So here's the actual verse I'm supposed to be reading. Rishinam buri viranam api sargam avishtritam gyatvatad dhar dridhaye bhuhyas chintayam asa kaurava rishinam buri viryanam api sargam avishtritam gyatvatad dridhaye bhuyash chintayam asa kaurava. O son of the Kurus, when Brahma saw that in spite of the presence of sages of great potency, there was no sufficient increase in population, he seriously began to consider how the population could be increased. So the story has been going that Brahma is trying to create progeny, but he's having one problem after another. So here is the next verse. This is 51. Aho adbhutam etanme Vyaprishtasyapi nityada nahe dhante prajanunam daivam atra vighatakam. Brahma thought to himself, alas, it is wonderful that in spite of my being scattered all over, there is still insufficient population throughout the universe. There is no other cause for this misfortune but destiny. So Brahma has been trying to create progeny, and he's been meeting with one setback after another. It's interesting that Buri Jan, in this section, he describes that even Brahma, the first being in the universe, the Trimurtis is one of the three deities that are very highly placed in the production of the material world. Still, he doesn't have an easy job. Still, he's got problems. And as Burijan puts it, even during creation, the other modes are sneaking in there. Destruction or the mode of ignorance is also happening. So things are being created, and at the same time, some things are happening that shouldn't be happening. So this is a difficulty that Brahma has to undergo. And it says there's no other cause for this misfortune but destiny. So the Supreme Lord makes a situation where even though Brahma is setting up the universe, it still isn't like an automatic or a easy go. So he's having to wrestle with things, and he's having setbacks. So this is a part of it. Each one of us, no matter what we do, whether we're insignificant or we're a great ruler or a great important person in this world, each one of us has issues that we wind up having to deal with, and struggles that we have to go through, and temptations, and all these kind of things. So if it even happens for Brahma, then what to speak of us? It's the way that the material world is set up. We have to struggle. It's a place of struggle. The material world is a place of struggle. So the next verse here, this one is 52. Evam yukta kritastasya daivam chavekshatastada kasya rupan abhudvedha yat kayam abhichakshate. While he was thus absorbed in contemplation and observing the supernatural power, two other forms were generated from his body. They are still celebrated as the body of Brahma. So there's a purport to this verse. Two bodies came out of the body of Brahma. One had a mustache, and the other had swollen breasts. No one can explain the source of their manifestation, and therefore, until today, they are known as Kayam, or the body of Brahma, with no indication of their relationship as his son or daughter. Of course, this is talking about Satarupa and Swayambhuva Manu. Tabhyam Rupa Vibhagabhyam Mitunam Samapadyata. The two newly separated bodies united together in a sexual relationship. Yastu tatra pumanso bhoon manu swayambhuvas varat shriyaschit chatarupa Pakya Mahishyasya Mahatmanaha. Out of them, the one who had the male form became known as the Manu named Swayambhuva. And the woman became known as Shatarupa, the queen of the great soul Manu. Tadamituna dharmena prajahedham babuvire. Thereafter, by sex indulgence, they gradually increased generations of population, one after another. So here is verse 56. Sachapi shata rupayam panchapat yanya jijanat priyavratotana padau tishra kanyas chabharata akutir devahutischa prashutir iti sattama. O son of Bharata, in the due course of time, he, Manu, begot in Shatarupa 5 children, 2 sons, Priyavrata Unutanupad, and 3 daughters, Akuti, Devahuti, and Prashuti. Akutim ruchaye pradat kardamaya tu madhyamam dakshayadat prasutim cha yatra apuritam jagat. The father Manu handed over his first daughter Akuti to the sage Ruchi, the middle daughter Devahuti to the sage Kardam, and the youngest Prasuti to Daksha. From them all the world filled with population. And this one has a purport, and it's the last verse of the chapter, I believe, yes. The history of the creation of population of the universe is given herewith. Brahma, the original living creature in the universe, from whom were generated the Manu Swayambhuva and his wife Shatarupa. From Manu, 2 sons and 3 daughters were born, and from them all population in different planets has sprung up until now. Therefore, Brahma is known as the grandfather of everyone. And the personality of Godhead, being the father of Brahma, is known as the great-grandfather of all living beings. This is confirmed in Bhagavad Gita as follows. Vayoryamognir varuna shashanka prajapatistvam prapitat mahascha namo namaste stu sahasra kritva punascha bhuyo pinamo namaste. You are the Lord of the air, the supreme justice Yama, the fire, and the Lord of rains. You are the moon, and you are the great-grandfather. Therefore, I offer my respectful obeisances unto you again and again. So thus ends the Bhaktivedanta purport of 3rd Canto, 12th chapter of the Srimad Bhagavatam, entitled Creation of the Kumaras and Others. So we have gone through a number of verses here. And as Pancharatna mentioned yesterday, these verses are not easy. And this is kind of a confusing section. I tried to do a little research just to be able to see if anything could be clarified. It's telling that the acharyas haven't commented on these verses very much. So I suspect that what's happening is that this part of creation is far more complex than we're assuming. And the whole story is probably quite detailed and involved and intricate. And what we're getting here is kind of an overview. And it means that what's happening is that Brahma is experiencing difficulties, he's experiencing temptations. He's the first being in the universe, and he's creating beings not in the usual way that we see creation happening or procreation happening in our times, which is through sexual intercourse. Of course, children come into the world. And that system is being set up at this point. But since Brahma is creating on his own, he doesn't have a wife, at least at this point. So because he's creating on his own, he's creating things from his body. His body, I've heard it said that he has a body of pure intelligence. And simply by thinking something, it can be generated. Now, Brahma's purpose is to create the universe. So just by thinking, he can cause things to be created. And by changing his mind, he's throwing off an outer shell. We've seen that already. And Burijan mentions that in this chapter, chapter 12 of third canto, and in the 20th chapter of third canto, very similar narration is there, both in the 12th and the 20th chapter of this canto. A very similar narration is given about Brahma casting off various created beings from his own body, from his intelligence. We hear that, someone comes from his deliberation. I think that was Narda. Someone comes from his thumb. Someone comes from his heart. Someone comes from his shadow, all these various things. So this is not the generation of children the way we usually hear about it, the way it works in the modern, our everyday world that we see. These generations are happening in an extraordinary way. The material world has certain restrictions, that things happen in this way and they don't happen in that way. So that's the way our material world works. But at a certain level, there are people who have the bypasses for these usual ways things happen. This is why the whole theory of evolution runs into so many snags. And it's also the same reason why the origin of life is unfindable to the scientists, because how life comes about has nothing to do with the processes we see today. It's happening in an extraordinary way. The beings who were first created in the universe do not have bodies like ours. They have a different kind of body. It's also material, but it's not like our bodies. And they are able to generate in a very extraordinary way. They are not subjected to the same restrictions or the same laws of physics that our world is subjected to. We're forced to do things in a very particular way. But they have some bypasses. They can do things in extraordinary ways. And similarly, we see that sometimes a thought comes into our mind and we just cast it off. Just like Brahma is casting off thoughts. I was experiencing that a little bit this morning in chanting japa. Sometimes you're just trying somehow or another to grab hold of the mantra and not get pulled away by some miscellaneous idea, and then because of the nature of our brains, a miscellaneous idea comes, and then you just let it get cast off, just like Brahma. You don't follow it, you don't develop it, you just let it like a balloon or a bubble, soap bubble. You're blowing a soap bubble and it just floats off. And I think in some ways this is kind of something like what Brahma is doing, that he's thinking of something, and because his thinking is not just thinking, it has a potency. Things are being generated just from his thinking. And his body is designed to generate things just on its own. So he doesn't have to do things the way that we do. And so the fact that Brahma generated, we just read the section where he generated Vak, his daughter, and then he became attracted to his daughter. Now, already Brahma's sons were aware that this attraction was not proper. So they objected to Brahma, and Brahma agreed and did not engage with his daughter. Later we find that the sons of Marichi, they did take exception to Brahma. And as a result, they wound up getting cursed. And then later they become the Sadgarbhas, the 6 children that Kamsa kills in children of Devaki and Vasudeva, before Krishna is the 8th child. And of course, Balaram is the 7th child. So these are not brothers of Marichi, but these are sons of Marichi. So Marichi and other sages, they respectfully approached Brahma, but his sons, Marichi's sons, did not. They actually were disgusted by Brahma, and as a result of their offense to Brahma, they were forced to become born in demoniac womb. That's a whole story in itself. I'm not going to go there today. Now, since Brahma is the first being in the universe, if he's going to have a wife, the wife is going to have to be either generated from his body or generated from someone who was generated from his body. So that's the only possibility, because there's no one else other than Brahma. And of course we see that in this chapter, Brahma has generated first, he generated the 4 Kumars who decided they weren't going to create progeny. Then he generated Shiva by his anger. Then he generated the 10 sages. We talked about that. And now he generated Vak, and then he will be generating, what we're reading about here is Shatarupa and Swayambhuva Manu. This story is kind of given some more details. Yesterday, Pancharatna was wondering about how Brahma could be contaminated if he had a transcendental body, how he could give a transcendental body up, how that body then becomes the fog, which causes illusion and problems. And these are definitely mysterious things. But we see that Brahma has been giving up bodies all along. And what we find out too is evidently Brahma is not supposed to be involved in sex, but later he takes a body where it is proper for him to be involved in sexual acts. And more than that, we don't exactly know. in the Puranic Encyclopedia, it states that Satarupa, well, let me preface this first, because whenever we're hearing or uh, uh, referencing things from the Puranic Encyclopedia, it can be coming from parts of the Vedas that are a little bit, um, we have to be careful about them. Because there are 18 Puranas, and 6 of them are Puranas for those in the mode of goodness, and 6 of the Puranas are Puranas for those in the mode of ignorance, and 6 of the Puranas are for those in the mode of passion. So what does that exactly mean? It means that the Vedic literature is designed to engage living entities. And not everybody is in the mode of goodness ready to accept devotional service. And Vyasadeva, he realized that just simply explaining philosophy does not work well for everybody. That most people will not be attracted to just hearing philosophy. So instead, he decided to explain through stories. And so there's philosophy and there's stories. And the Puranas, they have some storyline to them and they have some philosophy, all side by side. The Mahabharata is almost all story. But in the explanation, those Puranas, as I understand it, that are in the mode of passion, they are directed towards people who are of a passionate nature. They're directed towards people who have not a great deal of interest in actual bhakti. They have an interest in doing the right thing and being very powerful and creating something in the world and making their mark on the world. These are all passionate things. But these Puranas are designed to attract their minds. And similarly, people in the mode of ignorance, they're attracted also by different things. They're attracted by doing their duty in a basic way and a few other things like that. So that's why, for instance, Prabhupada never translated the other Puranas, especially, he didn't translate any of the 6 in the mode of passion or any of the 6 in the mode of ignorance. And sometimes these Puranas, they portray the Supreme Personality of Godhead in a strange light, as if he's not supreme, as if he's doing something for some mundane purpose. Because people in the mode of passion and ignorance want to hear a story with some intrigue. They want to hear a story with someone doing some heroic acts or something like that. And so sometimes it's like that. So that's kind of a preface. It mentions, and this comes from the Matsya Purana. By the way, the Matsya Purana is listed as one of the Puranas in the designed for people in the mode of ignorance. And it's mentioned in the Matsya Purana that Shatarupa was born from the body of Brahma, which is kind of what we get from the Srimad Bhagavatam here, that they came out of the body, both Shatarupa and Swayambhuva Manu. Now, in the Matsya Purana, it describes that Shatarupa came out of the body of Brahma first. And Brahma was attracted to Shatarupa. Now, is this the same thing as Vak? Because in some Puranas, it's also mentioned that Sarasvati, Gayatri Devi, Savitri, and Satarupa are the same person. In some Puranas, it's described like that. whereas other places, they're not the same people. Now, later in the Bhagavatam, it mentions that Sarasvati is the wife of Brahma. Uh, and so, is she the same as Satarupa? But Satarupa is also the wife of Swayambhuva Manu. So, was she the wife of both of them at a different time? Are these different people? Unfortunately, as you find out more, we just run into more questions than we had when we started. And that's why I said a little while ago that I suspect the situation is far more complex than we probably realize. And if we could hear or find the entire explanation, it would probably be quite an elaborate explanation. It would tie all these pieces together. But it's all right. The material universe is quite infinite, so there's no way to know everything about everything. So we do the best we can, and we get as far as we can get. But it mentions in the Matsya Puran then that from Brahma's body came Satarupa, and Brahma was attracted to Satarupa. But again, this was not proper. So Satarupa moved to the side of Brahma. And as she moved to the side of Brahma, Brahma developed a face facing that direction instead of turning his head. So then she moved behind him, and he developed a face facing that direction. And then she moved to the other side, and Brahma developed a face facing that direction. And this is the reason why Brahma has four faces. And evidently after that, she floated above Brahma, and he developed a fifth face on the top of his head, according to the Matsya Puran, which later Shiva clipped off. So he only has four. Shiva removed one of the heads. And that was over a argument. So at any rate, I'm not going to go into the details of that. So we can see how this is kind of intricate, that then later this Shatarupa is given as the wife of Swayambhuva Manu. So one of the names of Brahma is Swayambhu. So Swayambhuva Manu was coming from Brahma, and then she becomes the queen of Swayambhuva Manu. And as we read today, they had 5 children, 2 boys, which was Priyavrata the older and Uttanapad the younger, and then 3 girls, Akuti, Devahuti, and Prasuti. And so this is the first time where Brahma actually creates something that will start to generate all the population of the universe. Because we know, as we were just reading today, Akuti was given to sage Ruchi. Devahuti will be given to sage Kardam, and we're going to read about that in 4th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, the birth of Kapila Dev. That's Devahuti and Kardam Muni. That's an important marriage, and there's generation from there. And there's generation from Akuti and Ruchi. But really where things get going is Prasuti, who is given in marriage to Daksha. And of course, one of the daughters of Daksha is Sati, who is given in marriage to Shiva. That's a whole story. And Daksha insults Shiva, and Sati kills herself by causing her body to burst into flame, into fire. And then she reincarnates as the daughter of the Himalayas, or Himavati, and again becomes Shiva's wife, but in a different incarnation, so that she's no longer related to Daksha in that incarnation. But from Daksha and Prasuti, eventually we get the daughters of Daksha, 60 daughters. We know that Daksha first had, I think, 10,000 Haryashvas. Then he had 1,000 or 6,000 or something like that, Shavalashvas. And Narada Muni convinced them all to stay celibate, so they didn't create any progeny. Again, Brahma is being thwarted, and Daksha is also being thwarted. But then Daksha has these 60 daughters, and a certain proportion of them, I don't remember exactly how many now, were given to what's his name? Kasyap Muni. So from Kasyap Muni and these daughters of Daksha, we have the various species evolving. We have one of the daughters of Daksha is the mother of all the snakes. One of them is the mother of all the plants. One of them is the mother of the insects. One of them is the mother of the demigods. One of them is the mother of the demons. One of them is the mother of the birds. So we have these daughters of Daksha coming together with Kasyap Muni and creating children that don't resemble them. Again, they're not subjected to the same restrictions that we are. These are demigoddesses, so they can generate children that don't resemble themselves. And in some way they did that, although it's not detailed exactly how they did that. But this is how the various types of bodies become generated in our material world. They did not evolve from one another, as Darwin's theory suggests. Rather, these various species were begun at the very beginning of the creation of the material world and its population, and that was done through these demigoddesses who generated these various types of body. So this is kind of where we're at here. We've heard a little bit about Satarupa and about Swayambhuva Manu. We've heard about Lord Brahma and how he was tempted. So actually, one part of the story I left out in the Matsya Puran, that it mentions that after Brahma grew the four faces, at that point he lost his attraction to Shatarupa, and I guess at that point she was given to Swayambhuva Manu. But later on it mentions that his wife is Sarasvati, or Bharati. Sometimes she's given that name. And so where she comes from, I don't know. And I wasn't, the Puranic Encyclopedia didn't give any clues on that one. So this is a little bit about the whole thing. And we find that this theme, that one has to be very careful about associating with the opposite sex, because a sex life, especially illicit sex life, is incredibly destructive. It destroys the lives of people, and sometimes it brings into the world children that are unwanted. And this is very bad. It creates a situation that causes suffering. And we can understand that of all the attractions, all the kinds of um, material desires that one can have, the attraction for sex life is the most difficult to overcome. And it's sometimes called the Adi Rath because of all pulls or all tendencies. This is the one that's most difficult to control. So therefore, that's why um, the Vaishnava culture tries to some extent, regulate the interaction between males and females. Because if there's unrestricted interaction in a helter-skelter way, then we know that the possibility for men and women to become entangled with one another is quite likely. And then unwanted things will happen. There will be either illicit sex, there may be disease, there may be emotional fallout. We know very well these kind of things are seen every day in the outside world, and they're definitely seen in our movement as well. And we see that even on the highest level with Burma and in the demigods, these kind of things happen there too. So that's why if we chant nicely, we engage in service, then we tend to um, have some help from the Supreme Personality of Godhead to not become victimized by sudden illicit connection with the opposite sex. So as Prabhupada says, men are good, women are good, but men and women together are not good. They can get tangled up with one another, and all kinds of unfortunate situations can occur. So at any rate, we're nearing the end of the time I have to speak. I want to see if anybody has any questions. This is kind of a difficult to talk about group of verses, but I tried to do the best I could. What I told you that isn't there in Bhagavatam comes from mostly the Matsya Puran and some others. And the Matsya Puran is a Puran, as I mentioned, in the that's pointed or designed for people in the mode of ignorance. So it portrays things sometimes in unusual ways, but that's the details we have. So any questions or comments? So we see that our world is designed to allow for generation of children or population. And if it's done in the correct way, then those children are cared for and they're brought up in a family where all the necessities are supplied and there's a loving relationship. And that's why the institution of marriage is there. Not just in the culture of the Vaishnava tradition, but in practically every tradition, every culture, whether religious or not, there is some concept of marriage. Because for the bringing up of a child, there has to be some stability. And this stability is necessary so that children are protected, their needs are met, and they have the ability to grow up with everything that's required. It's a fact that, some children can grow up with either one of the parents missing or whatever. There can be some irregular situation. Um, but for the most likely good outcome for a child, the child should be protected by two parents. It's important for the growing of a young person to be within the confines, within the circle of a loving family. When children are exposed to the husband and wife fighting, or when children are exposed to a broken marriage, or different mothers, different fathers, some can cope with that situation, but others find it not easy at all. They find themselves with some psychological issues as a result of being part of a broken family. So, at any rate, unless there's any questions or comments, we can just end this class with this idea that there is a certain order to things. This is the point that I try to make over and over again, that there's a certain order to things, the way that it's designed for society to work, for people to work. Not absolutely everyone has to follow in the exact same order, but generally people will. And if those orders are accepted and followed, the idea of a husband and wife living together, having children, them being married before they have the children, them caring about one another, staying together during the life of the child, that has the optimum outcome of a child, for the child to be raised and have a sense of balance, and to have a good possibility of becoming a Vaishnava, a good possibility of becoming someone who is spiritually oriented. That doesn't mean that it's not possible from other settings, but this is the best way. And there's always exceptions and there's always rules. Generally, things usually work in a particular way. That doesn't mean that absolutely 100% will follow in the usual way things happen. But for the most part, that's why there is an order to things. These days, sometimes people want everyone to fit in a cardboard box. Everything has to be exactly a certain way, which is unrealistic. But on the other side of the coin, we also have people who believe that anything can happen in any kind of way, which also is unrealistic. So when we read the Bhagavatam, we hear about the order of the way things are designed. Then we try to understand that order, and generally speaking, we should try to follow that order. There may be some exceptions. No one can follow all the details to the T, but as much as possible, and then by following things as much as we can, then usually the best outcome will occur. And by good outcome, what we're meaning here is that there will be a tendency to engage in devotional service. Anyone can have a child. Well, all it takes is having some sex, But will that child be loved? Will that child be balanced? Will that child actually be directed towards spiritual life? If not, then those who brought the child into being have failed the child to an extent. Of course, no matter, even in the best of situations, sometimes children, because everyone is an individual and has their own free will, even children can decide that in a good situation, a good family, decide to do something completely different. Nothing can be done. But if the parents make the effort to try to um, bring the child into a loving home, they themselves understand what the purpose of life is. They themselves are not just talking about the purpose of life, but actually living the purpose of life. In other words, they're living the lives of devotees. If that's there, then the tendency will be for the child to follow in that direction. Uh, the most important thing for children to see is that the parents are not only talking about spiritual life, but the parents are living spiritual life themselves. They may have their issues, they may have their struggles, but if the parents are actually living spiritual life and not just talking about it, then the child will also tend to follow in that same direction. Not absolutely always, but most of the time. All right, so I'll end here unless there are any last questions or comments. Uh, this is kind of an interesting group of verses, and this idea is there of the difficulty in trying to do something like what Brahma is doing, the difficulty of being tempted towards illicit sex, which Brahma is being tempted, and the difficulties that come as a result of why we say that sex outside of marriage is a sin, because it creates problems for the people who are both engaging in illicit sex, and if a child comes into being as a result of illicit sex, then it creates problems for that child. We call that varna sankara. So all glories to Srimad Bhagavatam, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.